Greetings from Trinidad and Tobago in the West Indies. Let me wish all the conference organizers all the best, and I hope this conference is extremely successful. What is very interesting and noteworthy is that you all have allowed undergraduate presentations. I believe this is a very visionary approach, and it is very good to allow these young academics part in these proceedings. I'd also like to wish you all the best for Black History Month, and I would especially like to thank Professor Radford Hill of the Luther Diversity Center for allowing me this opportunity to speak to you all. I will be providing a summary of my paper, which is entitled Protestantism and Black Settlements in Upper Canada, 1830 to 1865. Now, before 1830, there were blacks in Canada. These blacks came during and after the American Revolution in 1776 and after the War of 1812. They settled in various parts of Canada. And during the time 1830 to 1865, there were various waves of blacks coming into Canada. And these blacks settled in areas such as New Canaan, Owen Sound, Colchester, Chatham, Niagara, Windsor, and St. Catharines. These slaves and free blacks that came to Canada from the United States, they came with a religious feeling, they came with optimism, they came with hope. And what I have gathered from the literature and the readings is that there was a lot of biblical associations with these people. There was a lot of Old Testament symbolism. These slaves, they called Harriet Tubman Moses. She was known as Moses of her people. Harriet Tubman was one of the most famous and vibrant conductors in the Underground Railroad, in which slaves passed from the United States secretly into Canada. These slaves, they call the Detroit River the River Jordan, like Old Testament biblical times. They saw Canada as the promised land. When they came into Canada, their hope was that they would begin a new Jerusalem. It was this feeling of optimism, it was this hope to live a better life that allowed these black settlements to succeed. They came with a positive attitude. There were various groups assisting these blacks to settle, various Christian denominations. Some of these denominations include the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the Wesleyan Methodists, the Anglicans, the Presbyterians, and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion churches. One of the most important settlements in Canada was the Boxton Settlement. The Boxton Settlement was started by Reverend William King, a Presbyterian minister from the United States. He was also a former slave owner. He came to Canada with his family and a group of slaves, and they started the Boxton Settlement in the early decades of the 19th century. This was one of the most successful experiments in Canada for the blacks. In this Boxton Settlement, they were able to have a lumber mill, they were able to have a brick factory, they were able to do planting, a lot of agriculture. They grew oats, corn, maize. Additionally, Reverend William King, he started Sabbath schools. These were special schools for blacks. He also built churches in the Boxton Settlement. It was a very close-knit settlement. And even though it was an all-black settlement, Reverend King and other missionaries tried to encourage blacks to integrate with the rest of society. It was indeed a segregated, isolated black settlement, but the vision of these white ministers and these white missionaries was that the blacks would be able to live comfortably and relate and interact with these whites. During 1851 to 1852, the Sunday school classes of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Toronto had 50 pupils. The Anglicans sent off Reverend Dillon to start a mission among blacks in London, in Ontario, Canada. Now, before I go on, present-day Ontario was known as Upper Canada, and the blacks settled in the western part of Upper Canada. Now, Reverend Dillon, in 1855, he established a school for blacks. This school had 75 pupils. And what is even more interesting, this black school had more pupils than the public school, which had only 19 students. Now, because it was a black school, does not mean that their standards and their quality of education was low or inferior. What is interesting to note is that the schools in Boxton Settlement and the schools that Reverend Dillon had offered a superior quality of education. Reverend King, he taught such subjects as Latin, literature, mathematics, and history at his school. Even some whites were attending these Sabbath schools, these black schools. And by 1852, the colored population in Upper Canada was 30,000. It was because there was this great demand for education that a lot of the white ministers decided to create these separate schools for blacks. In 1850, when the Common School Act was passed, it meant that separate schools would have to be established for the whites. There were some whites who were very racist. They did not want their children to be educated in the same schools with the blacks. Now, I should also note, this was not the case for all whites in Canada. Canadian whites, many were open-minded, but there were the selective few, like in the Raleigh Township, in the Chatham area, who were very narrow-minded. They were fearful, they were distrustful of these people coming with a different color skin, of these refugees, of these free blacks who wanted to adjust to a new host society. The American Missionary Association, they sent off Reverend Hotchkiss. He came and he built schools in the Chatham, Mount Pleasant, and the Puce areas. He established Sabbath schools in Hamilton, Sandwich, and Dresden. And by 1842, the Colchester Township had 3 separate schools for blacks. Now, what is also interesting is that these blacks, when they came into Canada, the white ministers were training them for future black leadership. They were going through a transition stage. They were being molded to become future ministers. And this was very true, particularly among the Baptist churches. We have people such as Elder Binger, and we have people known as Elder Washington Christian. These were some of the main pillars, the early founders of the Baptist church among the blacks in Canada. These blacks, they imitated the white ministers. They mimicked the white ministers. They began to learn to read and write. And this was very critical, because when these blacks were in the United States, when they were slaves on the slave plantations and the slave estates, their masters refused to educate them. Their masters denied them the right to go to worship in churches. The masters, the white masters, plantation owners believed that once the slaves were educated, they would no longer want to be slaves. So they kept these slaves oppressed, denying them education, denying them religion. One exception was Reverend Josiah Henson. Henson was born in 1789 in Maryland. When he was just a teenager, 13 years, he bought a book to read, and his master beat him for that. He later fled to Canada with his wife and children, but before doing that, he became an ordained Methodist preacher. Reverend Henson in Canada started up an all-black settlement known as the Dawn Institute. It was in the same county, Kent County, as Reverend King's Boxton Settlement.